the Bloody Marys and toss in extra Tabasco, folks. Olive to garnish for this fella. And bring a bowl of them, because this overthinker likes it spicy and salty. This party's coming to an end fast, but the hangover is going to last a lifetime. Through this 5-part series of Party Crashers, I've broken down American presidential politics to show how, despite the corruption and cronyism that has infected American conservatism since the dawn of our nation, the left, liberals, modern Democrats, just have never been able to get a leg up. But we've examined Kennedy to Clinton in Part 1, looking at the modern evolution of the Confederates of the slavery South, to the Southern Democrats, to the Dixiecrats, and on to the MAGA we all loathe today. We looked at the overarching theme of white supremacy in our nation's birth, Civil War, and the 20th century path that led us to where we are today, with Part 2, where we peek back into more in that colonial era, to the mid-1800s, while we covered most of the Reconstruction era and early 20th century in Part 3 of Party Crashers. This led us up to the eventual ending for most drunken parties. The crash. And it nearly killed us. Coming up, in the penultimate episode of Party Crashers, we're hitting for the cycle and rounding for home base as we pick up with one of the most corrupt and inept Republican administrations all the way to, well, our last most corrupt and inept Republican administration. In this episode, we've got a lot to cover on the timeline, and we've got to wrap Party Crashers up with a bow, because after this series, we're breaking down the American working class's hopes, dreams, and better interests with the progress of board games, an episode that takes what we've learned in Party Crashers, takes it to a whole new level, through the lens of the oppression and attempted eradication of American progressivism. Spoilers, that's where we're going to learn what actual socialism is. And welcome to the podcast. The corruption of the Harding administration, combined with both Calvin Coolidge's staunch and stubborn conservatism and the disastrous Herbert Hoover administration, breeds a sweeping change that's been brewing in America for over a century. And this period is very important because America got royally raw-dogged by their own political policy. Herbert Hoover, who served in the corrupt Harding administration and encouraged Harding to come clean about his corrupt cabinet, ran for president on a platform of assuring voters that America was nearing an end to poverty. Well, in less time than it takes to incubate a baby, Hoover's presidency saw the great economic crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. Hoover, a humanitarian in World War I, opposed America's entry into the Second World War. And look, it's easy to judge Hoover, but for reals, he inherited this Coolidge prosperity, right? And when that post-war World War I and tight budget bubble exploded, it exploded all over Hoover's face. And he tried desperately to stave off the coming catastrophe. He called industry leaders and employers and begged them not to lay off or fire employees, not to cut pay for employees, arguing that it would further hurt our economy. He offered tax cuts. He put people to work. This Republican, a conservative, saw that when this crisis arose, put the money into the people's hands if you want a chance at saving the economy. As American businesses closed and Americans began to feel the strain of poverty, even pushing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, basically a bank that was set up to help other banks and industries bounce back, well, that flopped. And Hoover sealed America's economic fate when he signed into law the Smoot-Hawley Act. The idea was to raise import tariffs to offset the lowered taxes for the people, but that's only a good idea on paper. The other countries didn't appreciate the tax hike and just stopped buying our stuff. But we needed people to buy our stuff. The Depression had set in and Americans were struggling. The 1932 presidential election pitted Hoover, without the luxury of Coolidge's economy, up against the former governor of New York and former vice presidential candidate just a dozen years earlier. This brings us full circle from Part 1 of Party Crashers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's first real, true liberal Democrat in more than a century. A dominating mandate was issued with FDR winning all but 6 states, all of those in the Northeast. Still considered somewhat conservative in his previous political positions, Roosevelt's New Democrats, with strong progressive influence, ran on real change for Americans. FDR's New Deal, a sweeping first 100-day strategy filled with broad-reaching programs. It was a risky gamble in an atmosphere where the idea of an overpowerful federal government had shed more than enough blood on American soil. Democrats hadn't had much luck getting any kind of momentum for 100 years in the White House. And finally, it takes a president with the vision to recognize that incorporating other philosophies, adapting them to fit your own as an alternative to the status quo, Roosevelt's landslide victory also brought about the end of a period of what many call the fourth party system, the Republican-dominated era from McKinley to Hoover, with Wilson's 8 years the exception. FDR's presidency ushered in the fifth party system in American politics that would extend to 1960 and set the stage for a new Democratic Party, one that would unite the liberals and progressives. The New Deal's success was a mandate for progressives who had fought hard for these policies during a restrictive and stingy Republican era before. Now, that cheap federal energy on the Tennessee River that we talked about in Part 3, remember? The one that Republicans just didn't want to fool with? Well, that became the Tennessee Valley Authority. There was an understanding that for the greater good of a society, a federal government of a nation this size should be more than what we thought it should be 100 years ago. The New Deal put Americans to work and reshaped the America we all know and love today. The dirty little secret, though, is these were largely considered socialist policies and were criticized by Hoover and Republicans. Even some conservative Democrats were alarmed at the federal expansion. Federal expansion. Again, here we are, with the federal government's power over and role to the American people at the center of it all. Federalists and anti-federalists. Americans versus Confederates. How would the Confederate faction of America, the conservative, evangelical, rural voters, embrace these democratic socialist policies? Conservative traditionalists, you'd think Republicans would have really clung to the trusty old Articles of Confederation, while the liberals would flock to a new progressive constitution. In fact, it was the other way around, which I'll explain in a moment. We've all heard the tired, spoon-fed, bullet point debate talking point that liberals fought to keep slavery, Democrats fought for slavery, and the conservatives fought to end the practice. It's more apt to clarify that conservative Democrats of the mid-19th century in America fought hard to keep the institution of slavery, while the more liberal Republican or Whigs fought against it, fought for abolition. And this confuses us for so many reasons, and that's why I'm doing this series of Party Crashers. Because these parties have sort of crashed into each other so much that, well, have they really morphed into each other? They haven't really, so to speak. We talked a lot about separating these terms, understanding that a progressive, that's an ideology of moving forward, and conservative is an ideology of holding true to tradition. These labels and terms are not party exclusive, or at least they didn't used to be. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next episode. Progressivism, once upon a time, was on both sides of the aisle. The political parties are made up of people. And people have ideologies, wants, and needs. And those change over time, and different parties will cater, compromise, and cave to those ideologies, wants, and needs. Sure, but it's also more apt to say that when one party refuses to cater, compromise, and cave to those ideals, those people will take those ideals and go wherever those ideals will be pandered to, if that makes sense. And now, the Democrats, the historical anti-federalists for crying out loud, the Democrats expanded the federal government larger and more far-reaching than it had ever been in America's history, and more than even the founding fathers could have believed. And it was Coolidge's Republicans who wouldn't budge, not even to save the American farmer in the years preceding the Great Depression that inarguably brought on the crash. I'm not kidding when I say FDR's win was a mandate. Just like after Woodrow Wilson, America was done with the previous administration, party, ideology. But also like Woodrow Wilson's in 1911, FDR's election was a sweeping win across a vast majority of America. When Democrats win, they win big, it seemed. It was just the winning that was the problem. Incidentally speaking of Wilson, progressives and how parties evolve. In the 1912 election where Wilson beat Taft, FDR's cousin, by the way, and Taft's two-term Republican predecessor, Teddy, I killed me a lying Roosevelt, he ran on the Progressive Party ticket, coming in a distant second to Woodrow Wilson. With FDR and Wilson, the wins in their first election were broad sweeping, capturing a strong majority of states from all over the nation. However, if you look, there's a concerning trend in American politics during this time period. In the three presidential elections from 1900 to Wilson and the three between Wilson and Roosevelt, there's a distinct North-South divide, with the South voting Democratic and the North largely Republican. It's easy to understand when you look at the smothering and short-sighted policies that brought on the Great Depression. The South saw the brunt of that lack of vision, and let's suggest that much of this was likely still prejudice, bias, and retaliation for those Southern states' treason less than a generation earlier. It's impossible to imagine that didn't play into the attitudes of the time. Give the South power, and all those yucks are running around, the South will rise again. So keep them from having that chance. Oppress the traitors, and they can't secede again. Remember this. It'll come up again. As we'll learn in the next episode, The Progress of Board Games, America's agricultural industry would be saved, rebounding from near decimation, with future Vice President and progressive Henry A. Wallace. Wallace, the third of his name, served as Secretary of Agriculture and was a huge advocate for government intervention into the failing ag industry. Wallace's father had served as ag secretary, and his grandfather, a minister, was well regarded and known throughout the Midwest's farmland for his journal articles on farming. And in this upcoming episode, I'm going to talk a lot about FDR's complicated yet successful presidency briefly, but it warrants a deeper dive here because the Democratic Party stood at the precipice of a turning point in American political history. Roosevelt's rival, Texas Senator John Nance Garner, was selected by the party as running mate to balance FDR's radical progressivism. Garner was a brash and unlikable little fellow who didn't care for the president at all, but saw it as his mission to do whatever he could to defend conservatism within the Democratic Party. Garner, like many moderates who wished to kowtow to Republican ideals, feared Roosevelt's direction. While opposing Roosevelt at times publicly, Garner was bigger than the vice president's office. This marked a significant change in how that office was treated. Before, it was largely administrative, ceremonial, assistant to the regional manager. But Garner took on a lot more and did quite a bit to benefit the party and the Roosevelt administration. Growing more and more dissatisfied with the direction of the party and the presidency, 1936's election would see another massive landslide victory for the Democrats. America was done with the Republicans and riding the bus to recovery with Roosevelt. For all the help Garner did in the first VP term, his second was almost all adversarial. He turned on Roosevelt, undermining the administration. The 1936 Democratic Convention is important. This is where they changed the rules that to win, you needed 2/3 of all delegates to a simple majority when it came to approving the nominee and their running mate. This rule change also enabled presidents to pick their running mates. This is important because, remember, Garner was forced on Roosevelt to balance the progressive policies, so the party didn't skew too far left, if you will. With balance on the ticket, the rules changed when they passed, and that process of picking the running mate still exists today. And it's not to say that there isn't pressure, but... Now, if you'll flash forward, Jack Garner is a thorn in the side of Roosevelt, that entire second term. There were some early disagreements in the first term, which set the stage for the split, but it mostly came down to control and power. Roosevelt enjoyed the new duties Garner brought to the office, but it was his unilateral and stubborn style, combined with just being a general son of a bitch to everyone, that ultimately was enough for the president. That and Garner just couldn't resist showing his ass. He was a hoot, don't get me wrong, so long as you weren't the target. In 1937, Roosevelt called a meeting at the White House. Garner and power players from Congress showed up to hear FDR lay out his plan to reorganize and reform and expand the Supreme Court. Oh boy, you want to irritate a conservative? Anything, Republican or Democrat? You talk some change. Conservatives lose their minds, and many in the room did. The suggestion seemed somehow un-American to Garner. The long game for FDR was to appoint 6 new justices to the court, which would guarantee decades of liberal reform. Many lashed out against the idea, worrying that it would politically bias the bench. Garner wasn't concerned so much about that as he was the unilateral handling of a very controversial topic. Roosevelt was an ask for forgiveness rather than permission kind of president. FDR's audacity to push forth such drastic legislation in such a bold manner caused a rift in the party and in Washington. While the American people resoundingly loved Roosevelt, many within his party were starting to raise questions. When the bill went before the Senate floor, Garner held his nose and issued a thumbs down. Yeah, thank God Twitter wasn't around back then. If that wasn't enough, when Congress prepared to debate the legislation, Garner was nowhere in Washington. He headed back to Texas. While he said it wasn't in protest, the intent was clear. The bill to expand the Supreme Court died with the death of Joseph Robinson, who was the Democratic Senate Majority Leader. Roosevelt tried desperately to combat the growing conservative movement in the party and to preserve the policies he felt would reshape America's future. Ultimately, infighting within the Democratic Party, just as it always had been, ignited a toxic working relationship between the president and vice president. Roosevelt tried to put a New Deal loyalist into Robinson's position. Remember, the positive effects of many of the New Deal's programs wouldn't be felt for years to come. The American people were poor enough. They didn't have much else to do but be patient. American politicians weren't as patient. And after the first 100 days and the New Deal really began to take hold, the party seemed ready to move in a more reined-in conservative era. Roosevelt had been contending with splintered factions within his own party. The party that just couldn't get it together was now the party that couldn't keep it together. Roosevelt had a vision and a plan. Jack Garner and his Confederate conservative cronies were no longer part of that plan. In 1938, FDR took on the Democratic establishment, who sought to undermine his authority, undo the progress that had been made, and hinder the progress to be made. The conservatives within the Liberal Party had conspired against the president's plans too many times. Roosevelt had unified the party 6 years earlier and managed the Great Depression. He won sweeping landslides. Still, the party was wary of the success. Maybe they were right. Roosevelt intervened in the primary elections, seeking to root conservatism from the party and push more liberal Democrats. Garner opposed the interference as unfair to local constituents. Garner warned Roosevelt that attempting to rock the boat of the party would ensure Republican victories. Garner was right. 81 House seats, 8 Senate seats were lost to Republicans in that election. Not only that, Garner's warning that what would be left for Roosevelt were staunch enemies in his ranks would prove correct. Except one of those enemies wouldn't be Jack Garner. This would pass. The Democrats would rebound, the party told themselves. By 1940, Roosevelt would move on and America would have a new Democratic president. So the party thought. A growing discontent was brewing again among Democrats so consumed with greed and self-ambition that they couldn't accept what was working. The balance of power was shifting with the New Deal, empowering the exploited American working class. Education, infrastructure, trade. The war was brewing overseas. Americans were adamant we stay out of it. But there was that impatience. Because the New Deal wasn't an immediate panacea for the Great Depression. America was struggling, seriously, and the second term for Roosevelt was difficult, thanks to Garner's obstinance and Roosevelt's ambitious arrogance. The decision to run for an unprecedented third term was problematic at best. Yes, the 1940 election was historic. Garner claims that at the 37th inauguration, Roosevelt and Garner mutually promised they would both retire at the end of their term. FDR, as he always did, had his own plans. In fairness, he wasn't wrong. A presidential election as vicious as they were getting to be, with tensions abroad and our unstable economy, it just wasn't the time and it wasn't in the nation's best interest to usher in change. Roosevelt's approach was to grant the American people the choice: keep going or try something different. The victory wasn't as huge as previous, but definitive nonetheless. Garner told folks he wouldn't openly campaign, but he wouldn't turn down the VP nomination. He wouldn't get the chance. Thanks to the new rules at the 36th convention, Roosevelt was no longer tethered to the toxic Confederate Garner. In 1940, when Garner finally had enough of the progressive bullpucky, he stomped back to Texas, and Roosevelt needed a replacement. Learning his lesson from Garner, both good and bad, FDR was a bit spoiled by Garner's ambitious approach toward the duties and sought a man who could carry more than the traditional duties of the VP position, while also looking for someone who would easily be able to adapt to FDR's ever-evolving vision of what the title should be. He also needed a loyalist, both to the administration and the New Deal. Roosevelt chose little-known politician and corn farmer from Iowa, Henry A. Wallace. Wallace had more than impressed FDR as Ag Secretary, saving America's farmlands from ruin. Wallace was a true hardline progressive, and that appealed to Roosevelt, who needed cooperation and less tension from his number two. Many delegates were not happy with the decision, and the American people were about to be pretty unhappy too. Franklin Roosevelt had assured the American people that if elected to a third term, America would stay out of the wars overseas. In pure Woodrow Wilson fashion, Roosevelt lied to the American people. The need for Americans' intervention in the war was clear for a while. It wasn't about whether we should, it was about how we could and still get the support of the American people who wouldn't tolerate another war and economic bust. Still, the promise was enough to ensure a victory a third time. The answer of how we got involved came later at Pearl Harbor, and America would be headed to war within months of FDR's third inauguration. Again, remember, the Democrats are pretty much using progressivism at this point to get America back on track. But their plan long-term and their tendency is to steer the party and the country right back to the middle. With Wallace, there was no balance. Hell, Wallace was a stark contrast to Garner in almost every imaginable way. Listen, if you're Roosevelt right now, you've got to be frustrated. Garner was a Texas cowboy, brash, loud, just a bastard, difficult to work with, and someone the president couldn't trust. Out with that and in with the new. Wallace was a soft-spoken and deliberately worded man. Not the greatest public speaker, Wallace was more gifted with the written word. He might fumble around delivering a speech, but the message was solid. And being that this was pre-media, many in Washington didn't really know him. He wasn't out giving stump speeches, and what speeches he gave, well, he was kind of an unknown. FDR traded the pains of dealing with Garner for a man with quite possibly a more liberally visionary plan for America than even FDR. In one respect, it was like the progressive dream ticket, right? But Roosevelt must have felt like he can't win for losing. He finally gets rid of this albatross around his neck in Garner, and he gets a passionate loyalist in place, and he's just so Wallace is really weird, man. He was really freaking weird. I mean, dude's quiet and intellectual, deeply pensive. He wasn't one just to run his mouth, right? Wallace instead was a listener, carefully processing his thoughts. Wallace wasn't outgoing like many politicians. He was reserved and shy. And he was also not a typical white Christian male of the time. Raised that way under a minister grandfather, Wallace considered himself a lot of things. His personal beliefs weren't the things of a typical Sunday morning sit and stand and pass the plate. Wallace preferred mysticism and New Age Eastern principles, Buddhism, Taoism. Wallace was a humanist who saw the world much differently. He thought differently than most in Washington. He looked and acted differently. And what do we know about conservatives and people who are different? Eh? The U.S. Senate website entry on Wallace quotes Alan Drury, a journalist who covered the Senate at the time, who said this, and I think it describes Wallace pretty well. Drury states, "A shock of silver-graying hair sweeps over the right of his head in a great shaggy arc. He looks like a hayseed, talks like a prophet, and acts like an embarrassed schoolboy." Drury seemed to like Wallace enough, regardless of the politics. The writer at least seemed to sympathize with the struggles Wallace faced. In his diary, Drury recalled it was difficult to, quote, "put into exact words the combination of feelings he arouses. The man's integrity and his idealism and his sainted otherworldliness are never in question. It's just the problem of translating that into everyday language and making them jibe with his shy, embarrassed, uncomfortable good fellowship that is so difficult." Sound familiar? And in prophetic nature, Drury's opinion on Wallace's political aspirations would prove true. Quote, "No matter what he does, it always seems to be faintly ridiculous. No matter how he acts, it's always going to seem faintly pathetic, at least to the cold-eyed judgments of the Hill." Washington wasn't ready for a mind the likes of Henry A. Wallace. And neither was Roosevelt. Roosevelt went from having the schoolyard bully by his side to having the kid the schoolyard bully bullied every day. Wallace was a constant reminder of that dynamic with every flubbed line in a speech, every snicker from his peers. Wallace's ideas and vision were disappointing we didn't get to see it play out. Roosevelt ultimately felt like he erred in judgment with his running mate. Wallace's vision, while initially in line with Roosevelt's, was far more progressive than even the president was comfortable with. Combined with Wallace's own failures to play politics, a game he seemed to not have the stomach for, spelled doom. In 4 years, Wallace just couldn't, pardon the pun, garner enough support among Washington Democrats. FDR was in failing health and just tired of all the Washington backbiting. Faced with the party going full-on progressive and reigning back to center, FDR just needed little to fight the 44 convention's ousting of Wallace from the ticket in favor of Missouri racist, the genocidal Harry S. Truman. Roosevelt was too ill to travel or do much of anything. Reportedly, he wouldn't even appear on camera at the convention. Wallace left with no significant allies, and a progressive movement that had been used and abused by the Democrats was out. By that point, America was benefiting from the progressive policy and couldn't care less how they got it. They just wanted to keep it going on. In 1944, America in full-on World War II mode, and the powers that be had a new toy to show off. The American government, Republicans, and conservative Democrats were eager to show the world what we were capable of. The only problem? Well, the war was ending, and it would end before we'd really get ready to show it off. With Japan on the indebatable brink of surrender, and I mean like they were about to issue the surrender, Truman dropped 2 nuclear warheads on 2 cities in Japan, poisoning the land, water, and people for 100 years at least. Many would call that genocide, a war crime. But Americans printed posters of mushroom clouds in red, white, and blue. While some may deem Wallace somewhat a disappointment as vice president, it's hard to reconcile that claim considering that while Garner assumed more duties than any vice president before him, Henry A. Wallace's turn as wartime vice president, taking on more and more and more responsibilities, saw an evolution in the role of vice president in our government that is still seen today. Wallace managed to impress, but impressing someone and making an impression, that's the difference between a politician and a president. Wallace was certainly impressive, but the impression you're left with was as confusing as Alan Drury's description. The progressive movement credits FDR for the New Deal, which proved that progressive policy and, yes, democratic socialism not only works, but has bailed out America's capitalism every time America's capitalism has failed, which is at roughly 8 times since Reconstruction. Roosevelt wasn't a far-left progressive. In fact, Roosevelt was a moderate by most of today's standards. He pushed the New Deal, which was mostly democratic socialist in nature, and won 4 elections on those democratic socialist policies. The American people voted resoundingly and repeatedly for those democratic socialist policies of the New Deal. Those democratic socialist policies we all benefit from today. In fact, Roosevelt, by all evidence, would be considered a moderate today and was prior to the New Deal. However, the moderate branch of the Democratic Party was weak and split. Far extreme conservative Confederate Democrats sought to urge the country back to center-right, while progressives and liberals realized that by compromising from the middle, you end up pulled closer to the opposition side, surrendering more of your principles. With this conservative extremism running rampant with the Democrats during this time period, Roosevelt realized that due to the strength of the Republican Party, despite their many failures of the early 20th century and the resurgence of the Democratic Party, bold moves must be made in order to keep the ship afloat. Ultimately, Roosevelt's death and Truman's appointment as president, then re-election in 1948, would take the Democratic Party in a new direction for the back half of the 20th century. Not that anyone tried to stop it, of course. Wallace, the humanist, would run against and lose to Truman on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948, and that would effectively be the end for Wallace in Washington. For America, Wallace almost certainly wouldn't have bombed Japan. That America cheered on as we ended the war with little regard for the cost on our soul surely weighed heavily on the former vice president. Though unsuccessful, Wallace sought to defeat Truman and the anti-progressive establishment of both the Republican and Democratic parties. It's an odd journey for progressives within the Democratic Party, but remember that the terms are fluid. Republicans have run as progressives: liberal, conservative, moderate, progressive. What the hell does it all even mean? Coming up in my conclusion to Party Crashers, we wrap up this 5-part series with a bow. We've rounded all the way back to modern day and set the stage for our next episode after this series, The Progress of Board Games. And we'll examine these terms a little bit more in depth as they apply to us today and have applied historically. Coming up, as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe, and do all the things I need you to do. And if you like this series, consider a donation to my Cash App or subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.